Hello, Lockdown Diaries, day 29. Just wanted to do a video about the Outback trip that we did in 2018. This was Garbage Run, Australia, where I took 8 riders across the Australian Outback from Brisbane to Perth on the Australian postal bikes, the Honda CT 110s. I contacted Joe at 110 Motorcycles in Caboolture to sort me those bikes out. He was a guy who I bought Dorothy from, the bike that I rode home to England on, and so I knew that when I wanted some bikes to do a trip like that, he was the best man to speak to. He knows them inside and out. He has a real passion for those bikes, and I kind of knew that if there was anyone to set me up with a fleet of bikes that were going to make the trip, then Joe would be the man. The idea was to ride from east coast to west, so Brisbane to Perth, taking him some of the great outback routes such as the Udnadatta, Strzelecki, Great Central Road, which runs out the back of Uluru. It was a 3.5 week trip, about 5,500 kilometres all up. It was interesting in that one because I did have a backup van, a support van on that, driven by Thomas, who actually you'll see some of his drone footage as well coming up. But Thomas was just a guy who'd explored a lot of the outback himself, and when he saw the trip I was planning, he said, what about having a support van with me? And I guess there's a little bit of pride that says, do I want a support vehicle? Is it cheating to have a support vehicle? But I think it was obvious that on a trip like this, when you've got 8 riders, some of whom had never ridden off-road before, and you've got 9 bikes, all of varying ages and mileage, and also a timeline to get across the outback, just how valuable a support van was on this occasion. I mean, we took parts. We essentially took a spare postie bike in parts. We had tyres and tubes and 40 litres of oil and all sorts of stuff to keep the bikes running. I mean, ironically, the only fault we had with the bike was on day one when the clip fell off one of the needles on the carburetors. Once we put that on, we didn't have a problem with any of the bikes on this trip, which was a real surprise. I think we expected to have niggles and problems and maybe engine blowing up or something, just because of the sustained heat and the sustained mileage we were doing. But if I'd learned anything from that Sydney to London trip, is that if you take those bikes steady, keep on top of the oil checks and things like that, and don't run them empty, then they'll just go on and on forever. So the bikes are a real I think the bikes were something we could rely on, which on a trip like that is something you need. If you can't rely on your bike to start every morning and take you, then it's a big issue. I mean, it wasn't without issue. Just after this footage was taken, or just coming up to it, Martin broke his arm, one of the riders. He just got very unfortunate and got cross-rutted in a dried up rut and went over the bars and broke the upper part of his arm, and it just really hit home the remoteness of where we were and where we were going, because the nearest hospital I think was 14-hour drive away. So we put him in the bike in Thomas's van, and he was driven to the nearest hospital, and that was his trip over. It was actually just after this camping spot. We just camped just after 3 Corners. Is it 3 Corners or 4 Corners? I forget. Just out west, just out past Burke and then Wannarin, Cameron Corner, and we camped there in the dunes. And the next morning, it just shows just how easy it is just to go wrong. He's a good rider, and he just got unlucky. So it just shows on an adventure that you never can know. You can never predict what's going to happen. But just endlessly remote riding, I think that's what really defines riding through the outback. You go 300 kilometres without a homestead or any place to stop. There are communities out there, and there are other vehicles such as the road trains making deliveries to the oil refineries that exist out there. But you really barely see a soul some days. One day we saw one other vehicle. Other roads such as the Udnadatta track, which is quite popular with the grey nomads, who are the retirees of Australia who have bought camper vans, motorhomes and things like that, who then roam around the country just, living on what's left of their pension. You'll see some of those through the Udnadatta track and also along the Great Central Road or the early part of it near Uluru. But for the most part, you won't see too many people out there, and it's interesting to see just how different the interior of Australia is to the coast. Obviously, Australia is sort of synonymous with coastal regions. I think when we visit Australia, we generally go to the coast, but as soon as you head inland, you realise just how big the place is and how little there is in it, at least on the surface. Obviously, there is intrigue and detail if you look closer. I mean, some of these aerial views of the sand drifts really fascinating how the country forms and flows and changes and adapts. I mean, people worry about the wildlife, but really, we didn't get a lot of issues. Kangaroos and things like that are the big one because they will jump out at you, and certainly riding at dusk, which was an issue we had on this one. We did the trip in May, which meant that we didn't get any real seasonal variations in weather or any extremes in terms of weather, neither really cold at night or boiling hot in the day, but it did mean it was getting dark at 4:30 in the afternoon. So it meant very early starts, getting on the road for sunrise and riding through to as late as we could. But that means riding, at dusk, and that's when the kangaroos come out. And I think that's when you're grateful that you're only doing 40 miles an hour, because if something jumps out at you at that speed, then there's a lot of margin for error there. But the terrain mainly was corrugations, and the corrugations really shake you to death, to be honest. You can't get enough speed to carry the same pace as the vehicles that have made them. Therefore, you're sort of hitting, you're running straight into every single corrugation. So it makes it quite a brutal ride. 8 hours a day or so we were riding. So I really have to, I guess, tip my hat to the riders who took part and made it, really, because it was never easy, and it wasn't probably as rewarding as I guess maybe they hoped, in a way. I think you've got this romantic notion of Australia and this once in a lifetime adventure, but day in, day out on the corrugations, it really takes its toll mentally, I think, and physically. Fatigue kicks in, and I think possibly the thing to learn is to allow more time in order to slow the pace down, in order to take more rest days and things like that. But it's such an unknown entity. Trip like this, it's easy to plan, it's easy to think, it's easy to anticipate, but until you get into the actual situation, you never know. These are the mine shafts around Coober Pedy, where you could, I think, whether you still can, but you certainly could in years gone by, you could literally just go and dig a hole and look for opals, because it was a lot of opal mining there. But this was right in the heart of Australia, where the temperature is really high, so the houses are built underground, and I thought Coober Pedy, even though we were only there a night, I thought it was a fascinating place. I thought it got a real character to it and a real sense of life and spirit. And I really wish we'd have stayed a little bit longer. Riding the posties on the faster roads of the Stuart Highway was a little bit arduous, I think, with the speed of the bikes versus the speed of the traffic, and the road trains, which are the big multi-axle, 4-car long or 4-trailer long trucks. They were very intimidating because they come past at sort of twice your speed, and the backdraft would blow you all about the place, and they didn't really allow a lot of margin for error, and they didn't like rolling off the accelerator either. So if they had to squeeze you off the road, then they would do. It was almost reminiscent of India in that regard. Obviously, we stopped at Uluru, and we stayed a night on the tourist centre there, and then out west on the Great Central Road, which is a 1,300 kilometre long, gravel, corrugated, sandy, empty, desolate stretch of road, which I think is going to be tarmacked at some point, because that's a lot of, that's a plan to tarmac some of these roads to allow better access to the communities that live along these roads. There's only 3 main communities along this road, and that's where you find the fuel and the homesteads. So after 300 kilometres of riding, you'll just come across a petrol or gas station like this, and just, it's proper rural outback way of life. And this homestead will provide all the food and the supplies and the medical help for the Aboriginal communities that'll live nearby. I think if you've got all the time in the world, you'd never be able to fully appreciate and explore all the nooks and crannies of the Australian interior. As I say, in a way, there's not a lot out there, but in the same breath, there is a lot. It's just that you would need so much time to properly explore it. But it's hard to believe that when the original settlers were going out west and they were going across that vast expanse, they must have wondered when it was ever going to end. And as we did, really, because you're just riding and riding and riding and riding, and cooking, eating, sleeping, riding, dealing with the corrugations. We unfortunately had an incident towards the end of the trip, and Chris, on the last 30 kilometres of dirt before we hit the final stretch of tarmac into Perth, he just got it wrong in a patch of sand. The bike bucked and came down and spiral fractured his tib and fib. And he was thankfully 30 kilometres from a field hospital who sent out an ambulance, and he was taken out to the hospital and then assessed over video phone with a consultant in Perth who decided it was necessary for him to get airlifted out. So the flying doctors came and picked him up, and he was taken to Perth and operated on. And he was out there for a couple of weeks after us, 3 weeks I'd say, recovering before he could fly home. So the importance of good health insurance and also the importance of a satellite phone, I think, got to be stressed. I rented a satellite phone before we embarked on the trip, and such an essential item to have out there, just so you can ring for help, so you can ring for advice, so you can notify people of your location or whatever, because there's no phone signal out there. The Outback is a foreboding place. There was a group not long after us. 2 riders died in the space of 24 hours on a group ride across the Outback on the Great Central Road, and it just shows, how quickly things can go wrong out there. So, in a way, this trip wasn't perfect. There was, maybe it didn't meet expectations in a sense. Maybe it wasn't the dream trip we'd hoped for, but I think you get out of a trip like this, and I certainly was. I think you're grateful that you made it in one piece. It might not have been pretty, it might not have been perfect, but the fact that you've conquered the Outback, which takes no prisoners, and there is so much to go wrong. There is so many elements that can catch you out, from the heat to the expanse of the terrain, to the road conditions, to the road trains, to the animals, to the spiders, snakes, if there are any out there. We didn't see any. So, it was a tough trip. And then those bikes were all shipped home at the end of that, registered as UK bikes. And it's those bikes that I use for the postal tours in North Devon now. So, those bikes are certainly a long way from home. So that's it. Day 29. Hope you've enjoyed some views of the Outback to counterpoint the dark, dreary nights of a British winter. So, see you tomorrow. Bye.